Chapter 14 of The Canadians of Old by Philippe Aubert de Gaspé. Translated by Sir Charles G.D. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. The Plains of Abraham. Il y a des occasions dans la guerre où le plus brave doit fuir. Cervantes. Why victus, says the wisdom of the nations, woe to the conquered, not only because of the ruin which follows defeat, but because the vanquished are always in the wrong. They suffer materially, they suffer in their wounded self-love, they suffer in their reputation as soldiers. Let them have fought 1 against 20, let them have performed prodigies of heroism, they are nevertheless and always the vanquished. Even their fellow countrymen forgive them hardly. History records but their defeat. Here and there they get a word of approval from some writer of their race, but the praise is almost always mixed with reproach. Pen and compass in hand, we fight the battle over again. We teach the generals, whose bodies rest on the well-fought field, how they might have managed affairs much better. Seated in a well-stuffed armchair, we proudly demonstrate the skillful manoeuvres by which they might have snatched the victory, and bitterly we reproach them with their defeat. They have deserved a more generous treatment. A great general, who has equaled in our own day the exploits of Alexander and of Caesar, has said, "Who is he that has never made a mistake in battle?" Why victus? It was the 13th day of September, 1759, a day accursed in the annals of France. The English army under General Wolfe, after having eluded the vigilance of the French sentinels and surprised the pickets under cover of the darkness, were discovered at daybreak on the Plains of Abraham, where they were beginning to entrench themselves. Montcalm was either carried away by his chivalrous courage, or he concluded that the work of entrenchment had to be at once interrupted, for he attacked the English with only a portion of his troops, and was defeated, as he might have foreseen, by the overwhelming numbers of the enemy. On this memorable battlefield both generals laid down their lives. Wolfe bestowing upon his country a colony half as large as Europe, Montcalm losing to France a vast territory which the king and his improvident ministers knew not how to appreciate. Woe to the vanquished! Had Montcalm been victorious, he would have been lauded to the skies, instead of being heaped with reproaches for not awaiting the reinforcements which would have come from de Vaudreuil and de Bougainville. We would have praised his tactics in hurling himself upon the enemy before the latter had had time to establish himself. We would have said that 100 men behind cover were equal to 1,000 in the open. We would never have imputed to General Montcalm any jealous and unworthy motives. His shining laurels, gained on so many glorious fields, would have shielded him from any such suspicions. Why victus? After the fatal battle of the 13th, the city of Quebec was little more than a heap of ruins. Not even the fortifications furnished shelter, for a portion of the ramparts had been shattered to fragments. The magazines were empty of ammunition, and the gunners, rather to conceal their distress than with any hope of injuring the enemy, answered the English batteries only with an occasional cannon shot. There were no provisions left. Yet they bring the charge of cowardice against the brave garrison which endured so much and defended itself so valiantly. If the governor, a new Nostradamus, had known that the Chevalier de Lévis was bringing succor to the city, and instead of capitulating, had awaited the arrival of the French troops, it is certain that the garrison would have been lavishly applauded for its courage. To be sure, the garrison showed itself most pusillanimous in giving up a city which it was no longer able to defend. To be sure, it should rather have put its trust in the humanity of an enemy who had already carried fire and sword through all the peaceful villages, and should have refused to consider the lives of the citizens, the honor of their wives and daughters, exposed to all the horrors of a capture by assault. Assuredly, this unhappy garrison was very pusillanimous. Woe to the vanquished! After the capitulation, the English left nothing undone to secure themselves in the possession of a place so important. The walls were rebuilt, new fortifications added, and the batteries immensely strengthened. It was conceivable that the besiegers might become the besieged. This foresight was justified, for in the following spring General Lévis took the offensive with an army of 8,000 men, made up of regulars and militia in about equal numbers. At 8 o'clock in the morning, April 28th, 1760, the English army was drawn up in order of battle on the same field where it had moved to victory 7 months before. General Murray, with this army of 6,000 men and 20 guns, held a very strong position, while the French army, a little more numerous but supported by only 2 guns, occupied the heights of Saint-Foy. The French were wearied with their painful march over the marshes of La Suède, but they burned to wipe out the memory of their defeat. The hate of centuries stirred the bosoms of both armies. The courage of both was beyond question, and 15,000 of the best troops in the world only awaited the word of their commanders to spring at each other's throats. Jules d'Aberville, who had distinguished himself in the first battle on the plains of Abraham, was with a detachment commanded by Captain d'Aiguebelle. By order of General de Lévis, this detachment had at first abandoned Dumont's mill under the attack of a much superior force. Jules was severely wounded by the explosion of a shell, which had shattered his left arm, but he refused to go to the rear. Presently the general concluded that the mill was a position of supreme importance, and when he gave the order to recapture it, Jules led his company to the charge, carrying his arm in a sling. Almost all Murray's artillery was directed to the maintenance of this position. The French grenadiers charged on the run. The bullets and grape decimated their ranks, but they closed up as accurately as if they were on parade. The mill was taken and retaken several times during this memorable struggle. Jules d'Aberville, the little grenadier, as the soldiers called him, had hurled himself, sword in hand, into the very midst of the enemy, who yielded ground for a moment. But scarcely had the French established themselves when the English returned to the attack in overwhelming numbers, and took the position after a most bloody struggle. The French grenadiers, thrown for a moment into disorder, reformed at a little distance under a scathing fire. Then, charging for the third time, they carried the position at the point of the bayonet and held it. One would have thought, during this last charge, that the love of life was extinct in the soul of Jules, who, his heart torn by what he thought the treason of his friend and by the total ruin of his family, appeared to seek death as a blessing. As soon as the order for that third charge was given, he sprang forward like a tiger, with the cry of "À moi, grenadier!" and hurled himself single-handed upon the English. When the French found themselves masters of the position, they drew Jules from under a heap of dead and wounded. Seeing that he was yet alive, 2 grenadiers carried him to a little brook near the mill, where he soon returned to consciousness. It was rather loss of blood than the severity of his hurt that had caused the swoon. A blow from a sabre had split his helmet and gashed his head without fracturing the skull. Jules wished to return to the fight, but one of the grenadiers said to him, "Not for a little while, my officer. You have had enough for the present, and the sun beats like the devil out there, which is very dangerous for a wound on the head. We are going to leave you in the shade of these trees." D'Aberville, too weak to oppose them further, soon found himself lying among a number of the wounded, who had had strength enough to drag themselves into the grove. Everyone knows its result, this second battle of the Plains of Abraham. The victory was dear bought by the French and the Canadians, who suffered no less severely than their enemies. It was a useless bloodshed. New France, abandoned by the mother country, was ceded to England by the careless Louis 3 years after the battle. Lochiel had cleared himself nobly of the suspicions which his foe, Montgomery, had sought to fix upon him. His wide knowledge, his zeal in the study of his profession, his skill in all military exercises, his sobriety, his vigilance when in guard of a post, all these had put him high in esteem. His dashing courage, tempered with prudence, in the attack on the French lines at Montmorency and on the field of the first battle of the Plains, had been noticed by General Murray, who commended him publicly. On the defeat of the English army at this second battle, Lochiel, after tremendous fighting at the head of his Highlanders, was the last to yield a position which he had defended inch by inch. Instead of following the throng of fugitives toward Quebec, he noticed that Dumont's mill was now evacuated by the French, who were pursuing their enemies with great slaughter. To conceal his route from the enemy, Archie led his men between the mill and the adjoining wood. Just then he heard someone calling his name, and turning, he saw an officer, his arm in a sling, his uniform in tatters, his head wrapped in a bloody cloth, staggering to meet him, sword in hand. "What are you doing, brave Cameron of Lochiel?" cried the unknown. "The mill has been evacuated by our brave soldiers, and is no longer defended by women and children and feeble old men. Return, valorous Cameron, and crown your exploits by burning it down." It was impossible to mistake the mocking voice of Jules d'Aberville, although his face was unrecognizable for blood and powder. On hearing these insulting words, Archie felt nothing but tenderest loving pity for the friend of his youth. His heart beat as if to break, a sob labored from his bosom, and again he seemed to hear the witch of the manor crying ominously, "Keep your pity for yourself, Archibald de Lochiel. You will have need of it all on that day when you shall carry in your arms the bleeding body of him you now call your brother." Forgetting the critical position in which he was keeping his men, Archie halted his company and went forward to meet Jules. For one moment all the young Frenchman's love for his adopted brother seemed to revive, but restraining himself sternly, he cried in a bitter voice, "Defend yourself, Monsieur de Lochiel, you who love easy triumphs. Defend yourself, traitor." At this new insult, Archie folded his arms and answered, in a tone of tender reproach, "Thou too, my brother Jules, even thou too hast thou condemned me unheard?" At these words a nervous shock seemed to paralyze the little remaining strength of poor Jules. The sword dropped from his hand, and he fell forward on his face. Archie sent one of his men to the brook for water, and, without thinking of the danger to which he exposed himself, took his friend in his arms and carried him to the edge of the woods, where some of the wounded Canadians, touched at the sight of an Englishman bestowing so much care on their young officer, made no move to injure him, although they had reloaded their guns at the approach of his men. Archie examined his friend's wounds and saw that he had fainted from loss of blood. A little cold water in his face soon brought him back to consciousness. He opened his eyes and looked at Archie, but made no attempt to speak. The latter clasped his hand, which seemed to return a gentle pressure. "Farewell, Jules," said Archie. "Farewell, my brother. Harsh duty forces me to leave you, but we shall meet again in better days." And he turned back sorrowfully to his troop. "Now, my boys," said Lochiel, after throwing a rapid glance over the plain and listening to the confused noises of the distant flight, "now, my boys, no false delicacy, for the battle is hopelessly lost. We must now display the agility of our Highland legs if we want to take a hand in future battles. Forward now, and do not lose sight of me." Taking advantage of every inequality of the ground, lending heedful ear to the shouts of the French, who were endeavoring to crowd the English into the Saint-Charles, Lochiel led his men into Quebec without further loss. This valiant company had already suffered enough. Half its men had been left on the field of battle, and of its officers, Lochiel was the sole survivor. All honor to vanquished heroism. Honor to the English dead, whose bodies were buried in confusion with those of their enemies on the 28th day of April, 1760. Honor to the soldiers of France, over whose bodies grows green with every succeeding spring the turf of the plains of Abraham. When the last trump shall sound, and these foes shall rise from their last sleep, side by side, will they have forgotten their ancient hate, or will they spring once more at each other's throats? Honor to the vanquished brave. Among the soldiers whose names are bright on the pages of history, there is but one who, on the morrow of a glorious triumph, uncovered his head before his captives and cried, "All honor to the vanquished brave." He knew that his words would last forever, graven on the heart of France. Great soldiers there are many, but niggard nature takes centuries to frame a hero. The field of battle after the victory presented a ghastly sight. Men and horses, the wounded and the dead, were frozen into the mire of blood and water, and could be extricated only with pain and difficulty. The wounded of both nations were treated by the Chevalier de Lévis with the same tender care. Most of them were carried to the convent of the Hospital Nuns. The convent and all its outbuildings were crowded. All the linen, all the clothing of the inmates was torn up for bandages, and the good nuns had nothing left for themselves but the clothes they were wearing upon the day of battle. Taking refuge after his defeat behind the ramparts of Quebec, General Murray made a vigorous resistance. As they had but 20 guns with which to arm their siege batteries, the French could do little more than blockade the city and wait for the reinforcements, which never came. The English general requested permission to send an officer 3 times a week to visit his wounded in the hospital. This request was readily granted by the humane de Lévis. Lochiel knew that his friend must be lying in the hospital, but he could get no news of him. Although consumed with anxiety, he dreaded to put himself in a false position by inquiries too minute. It might have been considered natural that he would wish to visit his wounded countrymen, but with true Scotch caution he let none of his anxiety appear. It was not till the 10th day after the battle, when his regular turn came, that he found himself approaching the hospital under the escort of a French officer. "I wonder," said Lochiel, "if you would consider it an indiscretion on my part were I to ask for a private interview with the Lady Superior." "I see no indiscretion in it," answered the Frenchman, "but I fear I would be exceeding my orders were I to permit it. I'm ordered to lead you to your countrymen, and nothing more." "I am sorry," said the Scotchman indifferently. "It is a little disappointing to me, but let us speak no more of it." The French officer was silent some minutes. He thought to himself that the Scotchman, speaking French like a Parisian, had probably made the acquaintance of some Canadian families shut up in Quebec, that he was perhaps charged with some message from the relations or friends of the superior, and that it would be cruel to refuse his request. Presently he said, "As I am persuaded that neither you nor the Lady Superior can be forming any designs against our batteries, I think that perhaps, after all, I might grant your request without exceeding my duty." Lochiel, who had been staking all his hopes of a reconciliation with the d'Abervilles upon this interview, could scarcely conceal his joy. But he answered quietly, "Thank you, monsieur, for your courtesy to myself and the good lady. Your batteries, protected by French valor, might feel reasonably secure even if we were conspiring against them." The corridors of the hospital, which he had to traverse before reaching the parlor of the superior, were literally thronged with the wounded. But Archie, seeing none of his own men, hastened on. After ringing the bell, he walked restlessly up and down the room. It was the same room in which he and Jules had had so many a dainty lunch in their happy school days, for the good superior was Jules' aunt. The superior received him with cold politeness and said, "I am very sorry to have kept you waiting, sir. Please take a seat." "I fear," said Archie, "that madam does not recognize me." "A thousand pardons," replied the superior. "You are Mr. Archibald Cameron of Lochiel." "Once you called me Archie," said the young man. "The times are changed, sir," replied the nun, "and many things have happened since those days." Sighing deeply, Lochiel echoed her words. "The times are indeed changed, and many things have happened since those days. But at least, madam, tell me, how is my brother, Jules d'Aberville?" "He whom you once called your brother, sir, is now, I hope, out of danger." "Thank God," answered Lochiel. "Now all hope is not utterly dead in my heart. If I were speaking to an ordinary person, there would be nothing more for me to do but thank you for your condescension and retire. But I have the honor to address the sister of a brave soldier, the inheritor of a name made illustrious by many heroic deeds. And if madam will permit, if she will forget for a moment the ties which bind me to her family, if she will judge impartially between me and that family, then I might dare attempt, with some hope of success, to justify myself before her." "Speak, Monsieur de Lochiel," replied the superior, "and I will listen, not as a d'Aberville, but as a stranger. It is my duty as a Christian to hear impartially anything that might palliate your barbarous and heartless conduct toward a family that loved you so well." The sudden flush which covered the young man's face was followed by a pallor so ghastly that the superior thought he was about to faint. He grasped the grating between them with both hands and leaned his head against it for some moments. Then, mastering his emotion, he told his story, as the reader already knows it. Archie went into the most minute details, down to his misgivings when his regiment was ordered to leave for Canada, down to the hereditary hatred of the Montgomerys for the Camerons, and he accused himself of cowardice in not having sacrificed even his honor to the gratitude he owed the d'Abervilles. From the utterance of Montgomery's barbarous order, he omitted not the smallest incident. He described the anguish of his despair, his curses, and his vows of vengeance against Montgomery. In painting the emotions which had tortured his soul, Lochiel had small need to add anything in the way of justification. What argument could be more eloquent than the plain story of his despair? Lochiel's judge was one well fitted to understand him, for she it was who in her youth had one day said to her brother, Captain d'Aberville, "My brother, you have not the means to worthily sustain the dignity of our house, except with the help of my share of the patrimony. Tomorrow I enter a convent. Here is the deed wherein I renounce all claim in your favor." The good woman had heard Archie's story with ever-increasing emotion. She stretched out her clasped hands to him as he described his anguished imprecations against Montgomery. The tears flowed down her cheeks as he described his remorse and his resignation while, bound to the tree, he awaited a hideous death. "My dear Archie!" exclaimed the holy woman. "Oh, thank you 1,000 times for those words!" cried Lochiel, clasping his hands. "My dear Archie!" exclaimed the superior, "I absolve you with all my heart. You have but done your painful duty in obeying your orders. By any other course you would have destroyed yourself irretrievably without preventing the ruin of our family. Yes, I forgive you freely, but I hope that you will now pardon your enemy." "He who was my enemy, madam, has gone to solicit pardon from him who will judge us all. He was one of the first to fly from the field of battle, which proved so disastrous to our arms. A bullet stretched him upon the ice, wounded to the death. He had not even a stone on which to rest his head. A tomahawk ended his sufferings, and his scalp hangs now at the belt of an Abenaki warrior. May God pardon him, as I do, with all my heart." A divine light beamed softly in the eyes of the nun. Born as revengeful as her brother the seigneur, her religion of love and charity had made her as all charitable as itself. After a moment of rapt meditation, she said, "With Jules, I doubt not you will find reconciliation easy. He has been at death's door. During his delirium, your name was forever on his lips, sometimes with the fiercest reproaches, but more often with words of love and tenderest endearment. One must know my nephew well, must know the sublime self-abnegation of which his soul is capable, in order to comprehend his love for you. Many a time has he said to me, if it were necessary for me tomorrow to sacrifice my life for Archie, I would die with a smile on my lips, for I should be giving him the only worthy proof of my love. Such love, in a heart so noble as his, is not soon or easily extinguished. He will rejoice to hear your justification from my lips, and you may be sure that I will spare no effort to reunite you. Since recovering from his delirium, he has never mentioned your name, and as he is yet too weak to discuss a subject that would excite so much emotion, I must wait till he gets stronger. I shall hope to have good news for you at our next interview. Meanwhile, farewell till I see you again." "Pray for me, madam, for I have great need of it," exclaimed Archie. "That is what I do daily," answered the nun. "They say, perhaps wrongly, that people of the world, and young officers particularly, have more need of prayer than we. But as for you, Archie, you must have greatly changed if you are not one of those who have least need of it," she added, smiling affectionately. "Farewell once more, and God bless you, my son." The superior succeeded in satisfying Jules with Archie's explanation. About a fortnight after Archie's first visit, Jules was awaiting him, filled with a nervous anxiety to prove to him that all the old love was yet warm in his heart. It was understood that there should be no allusion to certain events, too painful for either to dwell upon. Archie was ushered into a little chamber, which Jules, as nephew of the Lady Superior, was occupying in preference to certain officers of higher rank. Jules stretched out his arms and made a vain effort to rise from his armchair. Archie threw himself upon his neck, and for a time neither spoke. D'Haberville, after controlling his emotion with an effort, was the first to break silence. "The moments are precious, my dear Archie, and we must endeavor, if possible, to lift the veil which hangs over our future. We are no longer children. We are soldiers fighting under glorious banners, brothers in love, but enemies upon the field of battle. I have grown 10 years older during my sickness. I am no longer the broken-hearted young fool who rushed upon the enemy's battalions seeking death. No, my dear brother, let us live, rather, to see better days. Those were your last words when you handed over my bleeding body to the care of my grenadiers. You know as well as I the precarious condition of this colony. All depends upon a mere throw of the dice. If France leaves us to our own resources, as it seems but too probable she will do, and if your government, attaching so grand an importance to the conquest of Canada, send you reinforcements in the spring, we must raise the siege of Quebec and leave the country to you. In the opposite contingency, we recapture Quebec and keep the colony. Now, my dear Archie, I want to know what you will do in the one case or the other." "In either case," said Lochiel, "as long as the war lasts, I cannot honorably resign my commission. But when peace comes, I propose to sell the poor remnant of my Highland estate and come and establish myself on this side of the water. My deepest affections are here. I love Canada. I love the simple and upright manners of your good habitants. And after a quiet but busy life, I would rest my head beneath the same sod with you, my brother." "My position is very different from yours," answered Jules. "You are the master of your actions. I am the slave of circumstance. If we lose Canada, it is probable that most of the Canadian nobility will move to France, where they will find protection and friends. If my family is of this number, I cannot leave the army. In the contrary case, I shall return after some years of service to live and die with my own people, and, like you, to sleep at last in the land I love so well. Everything leads me to hope, my brother, that after a storm-tossed youth, we shall come to see happier days." The two friends parted after a long and loving talk, the last they were to have while the colony remained New France. When the reader meets them again, after some years, the country will have changed both name and masters. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Canadians of Old by Philippe Aubert de Gaspé. Translated by Sir Charles G.D. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. The Shipwreck of the Auguste. The predictions of the Witch of the Manor were accomplished. After the surrender of Quebec, the rich d'Abervilles had been but too glad to accept the hospitality of Monsieur d'Egmont's cabin, whose remoteness had saved it from the flames. The good gentleman and Uncle Raoul, with the faithful André, had gone at once to work and raised the narrow attic so as to leave the ground floor to the use of the ladies. To cheer the latter, the men affected a gaiety which they were far from feeling, and their songs were often heard, mingled with the rapid strokes of the axe, the grating of the saw, the sharp whistling of the plane. By dint of toil and perseverance, they succeeded in sheltering themselves tolerably from the severity of the season, and had it not been for the anxiety which they suffered in regard to Captain d'Aberville and Jules, the winter would have passed pleasantly enough in their solitude. Their most difficult problem was that of provisions, for a veritable famine held sway in all the countryside. The little grain which the habitants had harvested was for the most part eaten boiled, in default of mill to grind it. The sole remaining resource lay in fishing and hunting, but M. d'Egmont and his servant were rather old to indulge in such exercises during the severe weather. Uncle Raoul, lame as he was, took charge of the commissariat. He set snares to catch rabbits and partridges, and his fair niece helped him. Blanche made herself a sort of hunting costume, And simply ravishing she looked in her half-savage garb, her petticoat of blue cloth falling half-way below the knee, her scarlet gaiters, her deer-hide moccasins, worked with beads and porcupine quills in vivid colors. Lovely indeed she looked as she returned to the house on her little snowshoes, her face delicately flushed, her hands laden with her spoils. During the famine, the habitants frequented Trois Saumons Lake in great numbers. They had beaten a hard road over the snow, which enabled Uncle Raoul to visit the lake on a sledge drawn by a huge dog. He always returned with an ample provision of trout and partridge. On such fare they got through the long winter. In the spring, a veritable manna of wild pigeons came to the salvation of the colony. They were so innumerable that they could be knocked down with a stick. When Captain d'Haberville returned to his seigneury, he was utterly ruined, having saved nothing but the family plate. He did not care to come down on his impoverished tenants for their arrearages of rent, but rather hastened to their aid by rebuilding his mill on the Trois Saumons River. In this mill he lived several years with his family, till able to build a new manor house. A poor lodging, truly, 3 narrow chambers in a mill, for a family once so wealthy as the d'Habervilles. But they bore their misfortunes cheerfully. Only Captain d'Haberville, toiling with tireless energy, seemed unable to reconcile himself to his losses. His grief gnawed at his heart, and for 6 years there was never a smile upon his lips. It was not till the manor was rebuilt and the household restored to a certain degree of comfort and prosperity that he regained his native cheerfulness. It was the 22nd of February, 1762, and about 9 o'clock in the evening, when an ill-clad stranger entered the mill and begged shelter for the night. As was his custom when not occupied in work, Captain d'Haberville was seated in a corner of the room, his head hanging dejectedly on his breast. The voice of the stranger made him tremble without knowing why. It was some moments before he could answer, but at last he said, "You are welcome, my friend. You shall have supper and breakfast here, and my miller will give you a bed for the night." "Thank you," said the stranger, "but I am very tired. Give me a glass of brandy." Monsieur d'Haberville was not disposed to bestow upon a vagabond stranger even one drink of the meagre supply of brandy which he was keeping in case of absolute necessity. He answered that he had none. "If thou didst know me, d'Haberville," replied the stranger, "thou wouldst certainly not refuse me a drink of brandy, though it were the last drop in thy house." The first feeling of the captain was one of wrath on hearing himself addressed so familiarly by one who appeared to be a tramp. But there was something in the hoarse voice of the unknown which made him tremble anew, and he checked himself. At this moment Blanche appeared with a light, and everyone was stupefied at the appearance of this man, a veritable living spectre who stood with folded arms and gazed upon them sadly. So death-like was his pallor that one would have thought a vampire had sucked all the blood from his veins. His bones threatened to pierce his skin, which was yellow like that of a mummy, and his dim and sunken eyes were vacant, without speculation, like those of the ghost of Banquo. Everybody was astonished that such a corpse could walk. After one moment of hesitation, Captain d'Haberville threw himself into the stranger's arms, crying, "You here, my dear Saint-Luc! The sight of my bitterest enemy could not cause me such dismay. Speak, and tell us that all our relations and friends who took passage in the Auguste are buried in the sea, and that you, the one survivor, are come to bring us the sad tidings." The silence of Monsieur Saint-Luc de Lacorne, the grief stamped upon his countenance, confirmed Captain d'Haberville's worst fears. "Accursed be the tyrant!" cried the captain. who in the bitterness of his hate against the French sent so many good men to their death in an old ship utterly unseaworthy. Instead of cursing your enemies, said M. de Saint-Luc in a hoarse voice, thank God that you and your family got leave to remain in the colony 2 years longer. And now, a glass of brandy and a little soup. I have been so nearly starved that my stomach refuses solid food. Let me also take a little rest before telling you a story which will call forth many tears. In the neighborhood of half an hour, for this man of iron needed but little rest to recover his strength, M. de Saint-Luc began as follows. In spite of the English governor's impatience to banish from New France those who had so valiantly defended her, the authorities had placed at our disposal only 2 ships, which were found utterly insufficient for the great number of French and Canadians who were waiting to sail. I pointed this out to General Murray and proposed to buy one at my own expense. This he would not hear, but 2 days later he placed at our disposal the ship Auguste, hastily commissioned for the purpose. By a payment of 500 Spanish piastres, I obtained from the English captain the exclusive use of his cabin for myself and family. I then pointed out to General Murray the danger to which we should be exposed at this stormy season, with a captain not familiar with the St. Lawrence. I offered to hire and pay for a pilot myself. His answer was that we would have the same chance as the rest, but he ended by sending a little vessel to pilot us clear of the river. We were all in deep dejection, a prey to the gloomiest forebodings, when we raised anchor on the 15th of October last. Many of us, forced to sell our properties at a ruinous sacrifice, had but a future of poverty to look forward to in the mother country. Speeding at first before a favorable wind, with swelling hearts, we saw the cherished and familiar scenes fade out behind us and fall below the horizon. I will not detail the many perils we underwent before the great calamity, out of which but myself and 6 others escaped alive. On the 16th we came within an ace of shipwreck on the Île aux Coudres, after the loss of our main anchor. On the 4th of November we were struck by a terrific gale, which lasted 2 days, and which we weathered with difficulty. On the 7th, a fire broke out 3 times in the cook's galley, and was extinguished only after a desperate struggle. I shall not endeavor to paint the scenes on shipboard while it seemed likely we should be burned in the open sea. On the 11th, we escaped as by a miracle from being dashed to pieces on a rock off Île Royale. From the 13th to the 15th, we were driven blindly before a hurricane, not knowing where we were. As many of us as could do so were obliged to fill the places of the crew, who were so exhausted with their incessant labors that they had taken refuge in their hammocks, from which neither bribes, threats, nor blows could drive them. Our foremast was gone, our tattered sails could no longer be either hoisted or furled, and as a last resort, the mate proposed that we should run the ship ashore. It was a desperate expedient. The fatal moment arrived. The captain and mate looked at me despairingly, clasping their hands. I understood but too well the silent speech of these men inured to peril. We made for land to starboard, where we saw the mouth of a little river which might perhaps prove navigable. I explained our situation to all the passengers, concealing nothing. Then what entreaties and what vows to the Almighty! But alas, in vain the vows, and of no avail the prayers. Who can paint the madness of the waves? Our masts seemed to touch the sky and then vanish in the deep. A frightful shock announced that the ship had grounded. We cut away the masts and cordage to lighten her, but the waves rolled her on her side. We were stranded about 500 feet from shore, in a little sandy bay at the mouth of the river in which we had hoped to find refuge. As the ship was now leaking at every joint, the passengers rushed upon deck, and some even, thinking themselves within reach of safety, threw themselves into the sea and perished miserably. At this moment, Madame de Tillac appeared on deck, holding her little one in her arms, her long hair and her garments streaming about her in confusion. She was the picture of hopeless anguish. She fell on her knees. Then, perceiving me, she cried in a piercing voice, "My dear friend, must we die like this?" I was running to her aid when a giant wave thundered down upon the deck and swept her into the sea. "My poor friend," sobbed Madame d'Aberville, "companion of my childhood, my foster sister, nourished at the same breast with me. They tried to persuade me that it was merely my overwrought imagination that made me see you in my sleep that 17th of November. I saw you weeping on the deck of the Auguste, your baby in your arms, and I saw you swept into the waves. I was not deceived, my sister. You came to bid me farewell before vanishing to heaven with the angel that nestled in your bosom." After a pause, Monsieur de Lacorne went on. Crew and passengers were lashed to the shrouds to escape the waves which dashed ceaselessly over the doomed ship, every moment carrying away new victims. The ship carried but 2 small boats, one of which was already crushed into splinters. The remaining one, a mere cockleshell, was launched, and a servant named Etienne threw himself into it, followed by the captain and 2 or 3 others. I did not perceive this till one of my children, whom I held in my arms, while the other was tied to my belt, cried eagerly, "Save us now, father, the boat is going away." I seized the rope fiercely. At this moment a terrific wave struck us and hurled me headlong into the boat. The same wave which saved my life swept away my children. At this point the narrator's voice failed him, and his listeners sobbed aloud. Regaining his self-control, he continued. Although under the lee of the ship, the boat was almost swamped by another wave, and the next hurled us landward. In what seemed but a few seconds, in that awful and stupefying tumult, we found ourselves dashed upon the sand. Above the uproar we heard the heart-rending shrieks of those who remained upon the ship. Of the 7 men thus miraculously thrown upon the unknown shore, I was the only one capable of action. I had just seen my brother and my little ones snatched away, and I strove to keep down my agony of soul by striving for the safety of my fellow sufferers. I succeeded, after a time, in bringing the captain back to consciousness. The others were numbed with cold, for an icy rain was falling in torrents. Not wishing to lose sight of the ship, I handed them my flint and steel and powder horn, telling them to light a fire at the edge of the wood. In this they failed signally. Scarcely had they strength enough to come and tell me of their failure, so weak were they and numbed with cold. After many attempts, I succeeded in making a fire just in time to save their lives. Then I returned to the beach, hoping to save some poor creatures who might be washed ashore. I remained there from 3 in the afternoon till 6 o'clock in the evening, when the ship went to pieces. Never, never shall I forget the sight of the dead bodies stretched upon the sand, more than 100 in number, many of them with legs or arms broken, their faces battered out of all recognition. Half stupefied by the calamity, we passed a sleepless and silent night, and on the morning of the 16th we betook ourselves again to the fatal shore. We passed the day in bestowing upon the dead such sad last rites as were possible to such poor wretches as we. On the morrow we left this desert and inhospitable coast, and directed our course into the interior. The winter had set in all its severity. We marched through snow up to our knees. Sometimes we came to deep and rapid rivers, which forced us to make long detours. My companions were so enfeebled by fatigue and famine that sometimes I had to retrace my steps more than once to get their bundles, which they had been compelled to drop. Their courage was utterly broken, and sometimes I had to stop and make them rude moccasins to cover their bleeding feet. Thus we dragged ourselves on, or rather I dragged them in tow, for neither courage nor strength once failed me, till at length, on the 4th of December, we met 2 Indians. Imagine, if you can, the delirious joy of my companions, who for the last few days had been looking forward to death itself as a welcome release from their sufferings. These Indians did not recognize me at first, so much was I changed by what I had gone through and by the long beard which had covered my face. Once I did their tribe a great service, and you know that these natives never forget a benefit. They welcomed me with delight. We were saved. Then I learned that we were on the island of Cape Breton, about 30 leagues from Louisbourg. I made haste to leave my companions at the first Acadian settlement, where I knew they would be nursed back to health. I was eager to return to Quebec, that I might be the first to inform General Murray of our shipwreck. I need not detail to you the incidents of the journey. Suffice to say that with the greatest peril I crossed from Cape Breton to the mainland in a birch canoe through the sweeping ice cakes, and that I have covered now about 500 leagues on my snowshoes. I have had to change my guides very frequently, for after 8 days marching with me, Indian and Acadian alike find themselves utterly used up. After this story, the family passed the greater part of the night in bewailing the fate of their friends and kinsfolk, the victims of a barbarous decree. Monsieur de Saint-Luc allowed himself but a few hours' rest, so eager was he to present himself before Murray at Quebec as a living protest against the vindictive cruelty which had sent to their death so many brave soldiers, so many unoffending women and little ones. It had been thought that Murray's unreasoning bitterness was due to the fact that he could not forget his defeat of the previous year. "Do you know, d'Aberville," said Monsieur de Saint-Luc at breakfast, "who was the friend so strong with Murray as to obtain you your 2 years' respite? Do you know to whom you owe to-day the life which you would probably have lost in our shipwreck?" "No," said Captain d'Aberville. "I have no idea what friend we can have so powerful, but whoever he is, never shall I forget the debt of gratitude I owe him." "Well, my friend, it is the young Scotchman, Archibald de Lochiel, to whom you owe this eternal gratitude." "I have commanded, almost shouted, Captain d'Aberville, that the name of this viper, whom I warmed in my bosom, should never be pronounced in my presence." And the captain's great black eyes shot fire. "I dare flatter myself," said Monsieur de Saint-Luc, "that this command hardly extends to me. I am your friend from childhood, your brother in arms, and I know all the obligations which bind us mutually. I know that you will not say to me, as you said to your sister, the superior, when she sought to plead the case of this innocent young man, 'Enough, my sister, you are a holy woman, bound to forgive your enemies, even those who have been guilty of the blackest ingratitude against you. But as for me, you know that I never forgive an injury. That is my nature. If it be a sin, God has not given me strength to conquer it. Enough, my sister, and never again pronounce his name in my presence, or all intercourse between us shall cease.' No, my dear friend," continued Saint-Luc, "you will not make me this answer, and you will hear what I have to say." Monsieur d'Aberville knew too well the requirements of hospitality to impose silence upon his friend under his own roof. His thick eyebrows gathered in a heavy frown, he half closed his eyes as if to veil his thoughts, and resigned himself to listen, with the air of a criminal to whose satisfaction the judge is endeavoring to prove that he deserves his sentence. Monsieur de Saint-Luc detailed Archie's conduct from the beginning, and his struggle with his implacable foe, Montgomery. He spoke energetically of the soldier's obligation to obey the commands of his superior, however unjust. He drew a touching picture of the young man's despair, and added, "As soon as Lochiel learned that you and yours were ordered to embark at once for Europe, he requested an audience with the general, which was granted." "Captain de Lochiel," said Murray, handing him the brevet of his new rank, "I was going to look for you. Having witnessed your exploits on the glorious field of 1759, I hastened to ask for your promotion, and I may add that your subsequent conduct has proved you worthy of the favor of His Majesty's government and of my utmost efforts on your behalf." "I am most glad, sir," answered Lochiel, "that your recommendation has obtained me a reward far beyond anything my poor services could entitle me to expect, and I beg you will accept my grateful thanks for the favor, which emboldens me to ask yet one more. General, it is a great and inestimable favor which I would ask of you." "Speak, Captain," said Murray, "for I would do much to gratify you." "If it were myself that was concerned," said Archie, "I should have nothing further to desire. It is for others I would speak. The d'Haberville family, ruined like so many others by our conquest, has been ordered by your Excellency to depart at once for France. They have found it impossible to sell, even at the greatest sacrifice, the small remnants of their once considerable fortune. Grant them, I implore you, 2 years in which to set their affairs in order. Your Excellency is aware how much I owe to this family, which loaded me with kindness during my 10 years' sojourn in the colony. It was I who, obeying the orders of my superior officer, completed their ruin by burning their manor and mill at Saint-Jean-Port-Joli. For the love of heaven, General, grant them 2 years, and you will lift a terrible burden from my soul." "Captain de Lochiel," said Murray severely, "I am surprised to hear you interceding for the d'Habervilles, who have shown themselves our most implacable enemies." "It is but just to them, General," answered Archie, "to recognize that they have fought bravely to defend their country, even as we have done to conquer it. It is with some confidence I address myself to a brave soldier on behalf of truly valiant enemies." Lochiel had touched the wrong chord, for Murray was brooding over his defeat of the preceding year, and further, he was hardly susceptible to anything like chivalry of sentiment. He answered icily, "Impossible, sir. I cannot recall my order. The d'Habervilles must go." "In that case, will your Excellency be so kind as to accept my resignation?" said Archie. "What, sir?" exclaimed the General, paling with anger. "Will your Excellency," repeated Archie coldly, "be so good as to accept my resignation and permit me to serve as a common soldier? They who will seek to point the finger at me as the monster of ingratitude, who, after being loaded with benefits by a family to whom he came a stranger, achieved the final ruin of that family without working any alleviation of their lot, they who would hold me up to scorn for this will find it harder to discover me when buried in the ranks than when I am at the head of men who have no such stain upon them." Once more he offered his commission to the General. The latter became first red and then pale, turned upon his heel, bit his lips, passed his hand across his forehead, muttered something like a "God damn" between his teeth, and remained for a moment plunged in thought. Then he calmed himself suddenly, put out his hand, and said, "I appreciate your sentiments, Captain de Lochiel. Our sovereign must not be deprived of the services which you can render him as one of his officers, you who are ready to sacrifice your future for a debt of gratitude. Your friends shall remain." "A thousand thanks," cried Archie. "You may count on my devotion henceforth, though I be required to march alone to the cannon's mouth to prove it. A mountain of remorse lay on my heart. Now I feel as light as one of our mountain roebucks." Of all the passions that sway men's wills, jealousy and revenge are perhaps the hardest to control. Captain d'Aberville, after having listened with a frown, said merely, "I perceive that the services of Monsieur de Lochiel have met with due appreciation. As for me, I was unaware that I was so indebted to him." And he turned the conversation into another channel. Monsieur de Saint-Luc glanced at the other members of the family, who had listened with eyes cast down, not daring to discuss the subject. Rising from the table, he added, "This respite, d'Aberville, is a most fortunate thing. For you may rest assured that within 2 years you will find yourself free to go or come as you will. The English governor incurred too heavy a responsibility when he doomed to death so many persons of prominence, persons allied to the most illustrious families, not only on the continent, but in England as well. He will seek to conciliate the Canadians in order to ward off the consequences of this dreadful catastrophe. Now, farewell, my friends, and remember they are weak souls who let themselves be beaten down by misfortune. One great consolation we have in considering that we did all that could be expected of the bravest, and that, if our country could have been preserved, our arms and our courage would have preserved it." The night was far advanced when Monsieur de Saint-Luc reached Quebec and presented himself at the Château Saint-Louis, where he was at first refused admission. But he was so determined, declaring that his tidings were of the most immediate importance, that at length an aide consented to awaken the governor, who had been some hours in bed. Murray at first failed to recognize Monsieur de Saint-Luc, and asked him angrily how he dared disturb him at such an hour, or what tidings he could bring of such pressing importance. "An affair which you will assuredly consider worthy of some attention, sir, for I am Captain de Saint-Luc, and my presence here will tell you the rest." General Murray turned as pale as death. Presently he called for refreshments, and, treating Saint-Luc with the most profound consideration, he inquired of him the fullest particulars of the wreck. He was no longer the same man who had carelessly consigned so many brave officers to their doom just because the sight of their uniforms displeased him. What Monsieur de Saint-Luc had foreseen presently came to pass. Thenceforward Governor Murray, conscience-stricken by the loss of the Auguste, became very lenient toward the Canadians, and those who wished to remain in the colony were given liberty to do so. Monsieur de Saint-Luc, in particular, whose possible revelations he may have dreaded, became the special object of his favor, and found nothing to complain of in the governor's attitude. He set his tremendous energies to the work of repairing his fortunes, and his efforts were crowned with well-merited success. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Canadians of Old by Philippe Aubert de Gaspé, translated by Sir Charles G.D. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Lochiel and Blanche. After 7 long years of severe privation, content and even happiness came back to the d'Abervilles. It is true that the great manor house had been replaced by a somewhat humble dwelling, but it was a palace compared to the mill they had just left. The d'Abervilles had, moreover, suffered less than many others in the same position. Loved and respected by their tenants, They had suffered none of those humiliations which the vulgar often inflict upon their betters in distress. The d'Habervilles had never forgotten that it is the privilege of the upper classes to treat their inferiors with respect. They were besieged with offers of service. When it was decided to rebuild the manor, the whole parish volunteered its assistance to help along the work. Every man labored with as much zeal as if it were his own house he was building. With the delicate tact of the Frenchman, they never entered, except as invited guests, the poor chambers which the family had set apart in the mill. If they had been affectionate toward their seigneur in his prosperity, when the iron hand of adversity was laid upon him, they became his devoted disciples. Only they who have known great reverses, who have suffered long and cruelly, can appreciate the blissful content of them who again see better days. Hitherto all had respected Captain d'Haberville's grief, and in his presence had scarcely spoken above their breath. But now the natural gaiety of the French heart reasserted itself, and all was changed as by enchantment. The captain laughed and joked as he used to before the war. The ladies sang as they busied themselves about the house, and again the sonorous voice of Uncle Raoul was heard on fine evenings, arousing the echoes of the Cape. The faithful José was everywhere at once, and tales of the experiences of his late father, now dead, flowed incessantly from his lips. One morning toward the end of August that same year, Captain d'Haberville was returning from the river Port Joli, his gun on one shoulder and a well-filled game bag slung over the other, when he saw a small boat put off from a ship which was anchored a little way out. The boat made directly for the d'Habervilles' landing. The captain sat on a rock to wait for it, imagining that it contained some sailors in quest of milk and fresh victuals. As they landed, he was hastening forward to meet them, when he saw, with surprise, that one of them, who was dressed as a gentleman, was handing a packet to one of the sailors and directing him to take it to the manor house. At the sight of Captain d'Haberville, this gentleman seemed to change his mind suddenly, for he stepped forward and handed him the packet with these words: "I have hardly dared hand you this packet myself, Captain d'Haberville, although it contains news at which you will rejoice." "Why, sir," replied the captain, searching his memory for the name of this person, whose face seemed half familiar, "why should you have hesitated to hand me the packet yourself, if chance had not thrown me in your way?" "Because, sir," said the other, hesitating, "I might have feared that it would be disagreeable to you to receive it at my hands. I know that Captain d'Haberville never forgets either a benefit or an injury." Captain d'Haberville stared at the stranger, then, frowning heavily, he shut his eyes and was silent for some moments. The stranger, watching him intently, could see that a violent struggle was raging in his breast. Presently Captain d'Haberville recovered his self-possession, and said with scrupulous politeness: "Let us leave to each man's own conscience the remembrance of past wrongs. You are here, Captain de Lochiel, and as the bearer of letters from my son, you are entitled to every welcome on my part. The family will be glad to see you. You will receive at my house a cordial hospitality." He was going to say, bitterly, a princely hospitality, but the reproach died upon his lips. The lion was as yet but half appeased. Archie instinctively put out his hand to grasp that of his old friend, but Captain d'Haberville responded with a visible effort, and his hand lay passive in the young man's clasp. A sigh burst from Archie's lips, and for a time he seemed uncertain what to do. At length he said sorrowfully: "Captain d'Haberville can refuse to forgive him whom once he loved and overwhelmed with benefits, but he has too noble a soul to wantonly inflict a punishment too great to be endured. To see again the places which will recall such poignant memories will be trial enough in itself, without meeting there the cold welcome which hospitality extends to the stranger. Farewell, Captain d'Aberville, farewell forever to him whom I once called my father, if he will no longer regard me as a son. I call heaven to witness that every hour has been embittered with remorse since the fatal day when my duty as a soldier under orders forced me to enact a barbarism at which my very soul sickened. I swear to you that a great weight has lain ceaselessly upon my heart through the hours of excitement on the battlefield, of gaiety at ball and festival, not less than through the silence of the long and weary nights. Farewell forever, for I perceive that you have refused to hear from the lips of the good superior the story of my pain and my despair. Farewell for the last time, and since all intercourse must cease between us, tell me, oh, tell me, I implore you, that some measure of peace and happiness has been restored to your family. Oh, tell me that you are not continually miserable. Nothing remains for me but to pray God on my knees that he will shed his best blessings on a family which I so deeply love. To offer to repair with my own fortune the losses which I caused would be an insult to a d'Aberville. Though Monsieur d'Aberville had refused to listen to his sister, he had none the less been impressed by the recital of Monsieur de Saint-Luc, and by Archie's devotion in offering to sacrifice his fortune and his future to a sentiment of gratitude. Hence the degree of welcome with which he had received him. Otherwise, it is probable he would have turned his back upon him. The suggestion of pecuniary compensation made Monsieur d'Aberville start as if he had been touched with a red-hot iron, but this passing emotion was forgotten in the conflict of his feelings. He clasped his breast with both hands, as if he would tear out the bitterness which, in spite of him, clung to his heart. Making Lochiel a sign to remain where he was, he strode rapidly down the shore. Then he came back, slowly and thoughtfully, and said, "I have done my utmost, Archie, to banish the last of my bitterness. But you know me, and you know it will be a work of time to blot it completely from my remembrance. All that I can say is that my heart forgives you. My sister, the superior, told me all. I listened to her after hearing of your good offices in interceding with the governor on my behalf, which I learned through my friend de Saint-Luc. I concluded that he who was ready to sacrifice rank and fortune for his friends could only have been acting by compulsion in those circumstances to which I now allude for the last time. If you should notice occasionally any coldness in my attitude toward yourself, please pay no attention to it. Let us leave it all to time." He pressed Lochiel's hand cordially. The lion was appeased. "As it is probable," said Monsieur d'Aberville, "that the calm is going to continue, send back your sailors after they have had something to eat, and if by chance a favorable wind should arise, my good nag Lubine will carry you to Quebec in 6 hours. That is, if your business prevents your staying with us so long as we would wish. This will be convenient for you, will it not?" With these words he passed his arm under that of Archie, and they walked together toward the house. "Now, Archie," said the captain, "how does it happen that you bring letters and good news from my son?" "I left Jules in Paris 7 weeks ago," answered Archie, "after having stayed a month with him at the house of his uncle, Monsieur de Germain, who did not wish me to be separated from my friend during my stay in France. But it will be pleasanter for you to learn all from his own hand, so permit me to say no more." If it saddened Lochiel to see what one would have called before the conquest the d'Aberville village, replaced by 3 or 4 poor cottages, nevertheless he had an agreeable surprise in the prosperous appearance of the manor. These buildings, new and freshly whitewashed, this garden gay with flowers, these 2 orchards laden with fine fruit, the harvesters returning from the meadows with fragrant loads of hay, all this tended to dissipate the impression of gloom that had at first almost overwhelmed him. With the exception of a sofa and a dozen armchairs of mahogany and a few other small articles of furniture snatched from the flames, everything was of extreme simplicity within the new dwelling. All the furniture was in plain wood. The walls were guiltless of pictures, as the floors of carpets. The family portraits, which had been the pride of the d'Habervilles, no longer occupied their places in the dining room. The only ornaments of the new rooms were some fir boughs standing in the corners and a generous supply of flowers in baskets made by the natives. This absence of costly adornment, however, was not without its charm. One breathed deeply in that atmosphere, wholesome with the fragrance of fir boughs, flowers, and new wood. There was everywhere a flavor of freshness, which made it hard to regret the absence of more costly appointments. All the family, having seen M. d'Haberville in the distance accompanied by a stranger, had gathered in the drawing-room to receive him. Not having seen Archie for 10 years, nobody but Blanche recognized him. The girl grew pale at the sight of the friend whom she had never thought to see again, but recovering herself promptly, as women will to conceal their strongest feelings, like the other two ladies, she made the deep curtsy which she would have bestowed upon a stranger. As for Uncle Raoul, he bowed with chilly politeness. He had little love for the English, and ever since the conquest he had been cursing them with an eloquence not edifying to pious ears. "May I be roasted by an Iroquois!" exclaimed the captain, addressing Archie, "if a single one of us knew you. Come, look at this gentleman. 10 years ought not to have blotted him from your memory. As for me, I knew him at once. Speak, Blanche, you being the youngest should have better eyes than the rest." "I think," said Blanche in a low voice, "that it is Monsieur de Laquille." "Yes," said M. d'Haberville, "it is Archie, who has seen Jules very lately in Paris. He brings us letters from him, full of good news. What are you doing, Archie, that you do not embrace your old friends?" The family, ignorant of the change in the captain's feelings, were only awaiting his consent to give Archie a welcome whose warmth brought tears into his eyes. The last letter from Jules contained the following passage: "I have been taking the waters of Barège for my wounds, and though I am still weak, I am getting well rapidly. The doctors say that I must have rest, and that it will be long before I am able to take the field again. I have obtained an unlimited furlough. Our relative, the minister, and all my friends counsel me to leave the army and return to Canada, the new country of all my family. They advise me to establish myself there after taking the oath of allegiance to the English crown, but I will do nothing without consulting you. My brother Archie, who has influential friends in England, has sent me a letter of recommendation from one high in authority to your governor, Sir Guy Carleton, who, they say, shows great consideration for the Canadian nobility. If, on your advice, I decide to remain in Canada, I shall hope to be of some use to my poor fellow countrymen. God willing, I shall have the pleasure of embracing you all again toward the end of September next. Oh, what happiness after so long a separation!" In a postscript, Jules added: "I was forgetting to tell you that I have been presented to the king, who received me most kindly. He even praised me for what he was pleased to call my noble conduct, and made me a Knight of the Grand Cross of the Most Honorable Order of Saint Louis. I know not to what pleasantry I owe this favor, which every Frenchman who carried a sword has as much deserved as I. I could name 10 officers in my own division who should have been decorated in my place. It is true that I have had the precious advantage of getting carved up like a fool in every battle. Truly it is a pity that there was not an order for fools. Then I should have fairly won the distinction which his most Christian Majesty has just bestowed upon me. I hope, however, that this act will not shut the gates of paradise against him, and that St. Peter will find some other little peccadilloes to object to. Otherwise I should be greatly concerned." Lochiel could scarcely keep from laughing at the words "most Christian Majesty." He could see the mocking smile with which his friend would write the phrase. "Always the same," exclaimed M. d'Aberville. "And thinking only of others," exclaimed the rest with one voice. "I will wager my head to a shilling," said Archie, "that he would rather have seen the honor bestowed upon one of his friends." "What a son!" exclaimed the mother. "What a brother!" added Blanche. "You may well say, 'What a brother!'" exclaimed Archie fervently. "And what a nephew have I trained up!" cried Uncle Raoul, making passes in the air with his cane, as if it were a sabre and he on horseback. "There is a prince who can distinguish merit, and who knows how to reward it. His Majesty of France shows great discernment. He knows that with 100 officers like Jules, he could resume the offensive, overrun Europe with triumphant armies, overleap the Detroit like another William, crush proud Albion, and reconquer the colonies." Again Uncle Raoul carved the air in every direction with his cane, to the imminent peril of the eyes, noses, and chins of the rest of the company. Then the chevalier looked about him proudly, and, with the aid of his cane, he dragged himself to an armchair to repose after the laurels he had won for the King of France by the help of 100 officers like his nephew. The letters from Jules and Archie's coming made that day one of feverish delight at d'Aberville Manor, and Archie was pursued with incessant questions about Jules, about their friends in France, about the Faubourg Saint-Germain, about the court, and about his own adventures. Archie wished then to see the servants. In the kitchen, getting dinner, he found the mulatto woman Lisette, who threw herself upon his neck as she used to do when he came home for his holidays with Jules. Her voice was choked with sobs of delight. This woman, whom Captain d'Aberville had bought when she was only 4 years old, had some failings, but she was deeply attached to the family. She stood in awe of no one but the master. Her mistress she regarded as a sort of newcomer, whom she obeyed or not according to her whim. Blanche and her brother were the only ones who could do what they liked with her. Though Jules often tormented her sorely, she was always ready to laugh at his tricks and shield him from their consequences. Tried beyond all patience, M. d'Aberville had long ago given her her freedom, but, to use her own words, she laughed at his emancipation like that, snapping her fingers, for she had as good a right as he and his to remain in the house where she had been brought up. If her master, too utterly exasperated, would dismiss her by one door, she would promptly re-enter by the other. This irrepressible woman was as much affected by the misfortunes of her master as if she had been a daughter of the family. And, strange to say, during all the years when the captain was immersed in bitterness and gloom, she was a model of obedience and submission, and did the work of at least 2 servants. When she was alone with Blanche, she would sometimes throw herself sobbing on her neck, and the brave girl would forget her own griefs in comforting those of the slave. It is necessary to add that when prosperity returned to the family, Lisette became as willful as before. Leaving the kitchen, Lochiel ran to meet José, who came singing up from the garden, laden with fruit and vegetables. "Excuse me if I give you my left hand," said José. "I left the other behind me on the plains of Abraham. I bear no grudge, however, against the short petticoat, begging your pardon, who relieved me of it. The thing was done so neatly right at the joint that the surgeon had nothing left to do but bandage up the stump. We came off about quits, nevertheless, the short petticoat and I, for I ran my bayonet through his body. It's just as well, after all, however, for what use would my right hand be to me when there is no more fighting? No more war, now that the Englishman is master of the land," added José, sighing. "It seems, my dear José," answered Lochiel, laughing, "that you know pretty well how to do without your right hand as long as the left remains to you." "Very true," said José. "I can manage when I'm driven to it, as in the scrimmage with the short petticoat. But I confess that it grieves me to be thus crippled. Both hands would have been none too many to serve my master with. The times have been hard, indeed, but thank God the worst is over." And tears welled up in the faithful José's eyes. Lochiel then betook himself to the harvesters, who were busy raking the hay and loading the carts. They were all old acquaintances, who greeted him warmly. For all the family, the captain excepted, had been at pains to exonerate him. The dinner, served with the greatest simplicity, was nevertheless lavish in its abundance, thanks to the game with which shore and forest were swarming at this season. The silver had been reduced to the limits of strict necessity. Besides the spoons, forks, and drinking cups, there remained but a single jug of ancient pattern, graven with the d'Aberville arms, to attest the former opulence of the family. The dessert consisted of the fruits of the season, brought in on maple leaves, in birch bark cassots and baskets ingeniously woven by the Indians. A little glass of black currant ratafia before dinner to sharpen the appetite, spruce beer made out of the branches of the tree, and Spanish wine which they drank much tempered with water, these were the only liquors that the hospitality of Seigneur d'Aberville could set before his guest. This did not prevent the meal from being pervaded with kindly gaiety. The family seemed to be entering upon a new life. But for his dread of wounding Archie, Captain d'Aberville would not have failed to joke upon the absence of champagne, which was replaced by the sparkling spruce beer. "Now that we are en famille," said the captain, smiling at Archie, "let us talk of the future of my son. As for me, old and worn out before my time with the fatigues of war, I have a good excuse for not serving the new government. It would not be for me, moreover, at my age, to draw the sword against France, whom I have served for more than 30 years. Rather death 100 times." "And, like Hector the Trojan," interrupted Uncle Raoul, "we can all say, Si per gama dextra defendi possent, etiam hoc defensa fuissent." "Never mind Hector the Trojan," exclaimed Monsieur d'Aberville, who, not being as learned as his brother, had small taste for his quotations. "Never mind Hector the Trojan, who was not greatly concerned with our family affairs. Let us return to Jules. His health compels him to withdraw from the service, perhaps for a long time, or even permanently. His dearest interests are here, where he was born. Canada is his true fatherland. He cannot have the same affection for the land of his ancestors. His position, moreover, is very different from mine. What would be cowardice for me, standing on the edge of the tomb, is but an act of duty for him who is but on the threshold of life. Splendidly has he paid his debt to the country of his fathers. He retires honorably from a service which the doctors order him to leave. Now let him consecrate his energy and his abilities to the service of his fellow Canadians. The new governor is already well disposed toward us. He welcomes those of my countrymen who have intercourse with him. He has many times expressed his sympathy for the brave officers whom he had met face to face on the battlefield, and whom fate, not their courage, had betrayed. In the gatherings at Chateau St. Louis, he shows the same regard for Canadians as for his own countrymen, as much for those of us who have lost all as for those more fortunate who can maintain a dignity suitable to their rank. Under his administration, and supported by the strong recommendations which our friend Lochiel has procured for him, Jules has every reason to hope for a high position in the colony. Let him take the oath of allegiance to the English crown, and my last words when I bid him a final farewell shall be, serve your English sovereign with the same zeal, devotion, and loyalty with which I have served the French king, and receive my blessing." Everyone was struck by this sudden change of sentiment in the head of the family. They forgot that adversity is a hard master who bends the most stubborn heart beneath his grasp of steel. Captain d'Aberville, too proud and too loyal to acknowledge openly that Louis XV had wronged the subjects who had served him with a heroism so devoted, nevertheless felt keenly the ingratitude of the French court. Although stung to the quick by such treatment, he was ready to shed the last drop of his blood for this voluptuous monarch given over to the whims of his mistresses. But there his devotion ceased. He would have refused for himself the favors of the new government, but he was too just to sacrifice his son's future to a sentiment with so slight a basis. "Let each one now express his opinion freely," said the captain, smiling, "and let the majority decide." The ladies answered this appeal by throwing themselves into his arms. Uncle Raoul seized his brother's hand, shook it vigorously, and exclaimed, "Nestor of old could not have spoken more wisely." "Nor could we have been more delighted," said Archie, "if we had had the advantage of listening to the very words of that most venerable Grecian." As the tide was full and the river beautifully calm, Archie proposed to Blanche a walk along the lovely shore, which stretches, varied with sandy coves, from the manor to the little Port Joli river. "Everything I see," said Archie as they moved along the river's edge, the level rays of the sunset making a path of red gold from their feet to the far-off mountains, "everything I see is rich with sweet memories. Here, when you were a child, I taught you to play with the shells which I picked up along this shore. In this little bay I taught my brother Jules to swim. There are the same strawberry beds and raspberry thickets whence we plucked the fruit you were so fond of. Here, seated, book in hand, on this little rock, you used to wait the return of Jules and me from hunting, to congratulate us on our success or mock at our empty game bags. Not a tree, a bush, a shrub, but looks to me like an old and dear acquaintance. Oh, happy childhood, happy youth! Ever rejoicing in the present, forgetful of the past, careless of the future, life rolls along as gently as the current of this pretty stream which we are now crossing. It was then that we were wise, Jules and I, when our highest ambition was to pass our days together here, happy in our work and our hunting." "Just such a life of monotony and peace," interrupted Blanche, "is that to which our sex is doomed. God, in giving man strength and courage, set him apart for the loftier destinies. What must be the enthusiasm of a man in the midst of the battle? What sight more sublime than that of the soldier facing death 100 times in the tumult for all he holds most dear? What must be the fierce exultation of the warrior when the bugles sound for victory?" This noble girl knew of no glory but that of arms. Her father, almost incessantly in the field, came back to the bosom of his family only to rehearse the exploits of his comrades in arms. And Blanche, while yet a child, had become steeped with martial ardor. "There are triumphs all too dearly bought," answered Archie, "when one considers the disasters that have followed in their train, when one remembers the tears of the widow and the orphan, robbed of their dearest. But here we are at the Port Joli, well named, with its sunny banks gay with wild rose thickets, its groves of fir and spruce, and its coverts of red willow. What memories cling about this lovely stream! I see again your gentle mother and your good aunt seated here on the grass on a fair evening in August, while we are paddling upstream in our little green canoe to Babin's islet, keeping time with our paddles as we sing in chorus the refrain of your pretty song, We're afloat on the water so blue. We are bound for our isle of delight. I hear again the voice of your mother calling repeatedly. Go and get Blanche at once, you incorrigibles. It is supper time, and you know your father expects punctuality at meals. And Jules would answer, paddling with all his might, do not fear my father's anger. I will take the whole responsibility on my own shoulders. I will make him laugh by telling him that, like His Majesty Louis XIV, he had expected to wait. You know I am a spoiled child in the holidays." "Dear fellow," said Blanche, "he was sad enough that day when you and I found him hiding in this fir grove, where he had concealed himself to escape the first heat of father's indignation." "And he had not done anything so very dreadful after all," said Archie, laughing. "Let us enumerate his crimes," replied Blanche, counting on her fingers. "First, he had disobeyed father's orders by harnessing to the carriage an unruly 3-year-old filly, which was scarcely to be managed even in a sleigh. Secondly, after a hard tussle with the rash young driver, the filly had taken the bit in her teeth, and as the first proof of her freedom, had crushed the unhappy cow belonging to our neighbor, Widow Maurice." "A most happy accident for said widow," interposed Archie, "for your father replaced the old animal with 2 of the finest heifers in his pastures. I remember the anxiety of the poor woman when she learned that some officious spectator had informed your father of the accident. How does it happen that the people whom Jules tormented most assiduously are just the ones who were most devoted to him? What is the spell by which he compels everybody to love him? Widow Maurice used to have hardly a moment's peace while we were home for the holidays, yet she was always in tears when she came to bid Jules good-bye." "The reason is not far to seek," said Blanche. "It is that all know his kind heart. You know, moreover, by experience, Archie, that those whom he loves best are just the ones that he teases most unremittingly. But let us continue our enumeration of his misdemeanors on that unlucky day. Thirdly, after killing the cow, the ugly brute ran against a fence, broke one of the wheels, and hurled the driver 15 feet into the meadow beyond. But Jules, who always falls on his feet like a cat, was in no way the worse for this adventure. Fourthly, and lastly, after smashing the carriage to splinters on the rocks of the Trois Saumons River, the mare ended by breaking her own legs on the shore, over in the parish of Lillet." "Yes," added Archie, "and I remember how eloquently you pleaded for the culprit, who, in despair at having so deeply offended so good a father, was in danger of proceeding to rash extremities against himself. Dear papa, you said, should you not rather thank Heaven for having preserved Jules' life? What matters the loss of a cow, a horse, a carriage? You might have seen his bleeding body brought home to you." "Come, let us talk no more about it," was your father's reply. "Go and look for your rascal of a brother, for I doubt not you and Archie know where he has taken refuge after his nice performances." "I see yet," continued Archie, "the half penitent, half comical air of Jules when he knew the storm had blown over. What, my father," he ended by saying, after listening to some energetic remonstrances, "would you have preferred to see me dragged to my death, like another Hippolytus, by the horse which your hands had nourished to be the murderer of your son? Would you have chosen to see my ensanguined locks dangling on the brambles?" To which the captain answered, "Come, let's to supper, since there seems to be a God for such madcaps as you." "Now, that's more like the way to talk to a fellow," was Jules' response. "I never could quite understand," continued Archie, "why your father, who is ordinarily so unforgiving, used to forgive and forget so easily any offense of Jules." "Father knows," said Blanche, "that Jules loves him devotedly, and would endure anything to spare him pain. For all his headlong thoughtlessness, Jules could never offend my father deeply." "Now that we have called up so many pleasant memories," said Archie, "let us sit down on this hillock, where we have so often before rested, and let us speak of more serious matters. I have decided to settle in Canada. I have lately sold a property which was left to me by one of my cousins. My fortune, although but moderate in the old country, will be counted large out here, where my happiest days have been spent, and where I propose to live and die among my friends. What do you say, Blanche?" "Nothing in the world could please us more. Oh, how happy Jules will be! How glad we will all be!" "Yes, you will all be pleased, doubtless, but my happiness can never be perfect, Blanche, unless you will consent to make it so by giving me your hand. I love—" The girl sprang to her feet as if an adder had stung her. With trembling lips and pale with anger, she cried: "You offend me, Captain de Lochiel. You have not considered the cruelty of the offer you are making me. Is it now you make me such a proposal, when the flames that you and yours have lighted in my unhappy country are hardly yet extinguished? Is it now, while the smoke yet rises from our ruined homes, that you offer me the hand of one of our destroyers? There would indeed be a bitter irony in lighting the marriage torch at the smoking ashes of my unhappy country. They would say, Captain de Lochiel, that your gold had bought the hand of the poor Canadian girl, and never will a d'Haberville endure such humiliation. Oh, Archie, Archie, I would never have expected it of you, you, the friend of my childhood. You know not what you are doing." And Blanche burst into tears. Never had the noble Canadian girl appeared so beautiful in Archie's eyes as now, when she rejected with proud disdain the hand of one of her country's conquerors. "Calm yourself, Blanche," answered Lochiel. "I admire your patriotism. I appreciate the exalted delicacy of your sentiments, however unjust they may be toward the friend of your childhood. Never would a Cameron of Lochiel give offense to any lady, least of all to the sister of Jules d'Haberville, to the daughter of his benefactor. You know, Blanche, that I never act without due reflection. For you to reject with scorn the hand of an Englishman so soon after the conquest would be but natural in a d'Haberville. But as for me, Blanche, you know that I have loved you long. You could not be ignorant of it, in spite of my silence. The penniless young exile would have failed in every honorable sentiment had he declared his love for the daughter of his rich benefactor. Is it because I am rich now? Is it because the chance of war has made us victorious in the struggle? Is it because fate made of me an unwilling instrument of destruction? Is it because of all this that I must bury in my heart one of the noblest emotions of our nature, and acknowledge myself defeated without an effort? No, Blanche, you surely cannot think it. You have spoken without reflection. You regret the harsh words which have escaped you. Speak, Blanche, and say that you did not mean it." "I will be candid with you, Archie," replied Blanche. "I will be as frank as a peasant girl who has studied neither her feelings nor her words, as a country girl who has forgotten the conventionalities of that society from which she has so long been banished, and I will speak with my heart upon my lips. You had all that could captivate a girl of 15 years: noble birth, wit, beauty, strength, and a generous and lofty heart. What more could be needed to charm an enthusiastic girl? Archie, if the penniless young exile had asked my parents for my hand, and they had granted his request, I should have been proud and happy to obey. But, Captain de Lochiel, there is now a gulf between us, which I will never cross." And again the girl's voice was choked with sobs. "But I implore you, my brother Archie," continued she, taking his hand, "do not alter your intention of settling in Canada. Buy property in our neighborhood so that we can see you continually. And if in the ordinary course of nature, for you are 8 years older than I should have the unhappiness to lose you, be sure that you would be mourned as bitterly by your sister Blanche as if she had been your wife. And now it is getting late, Archie, and we must return to the house," she added, pressing his hand affectionately between both of hers. "You will never be so cruel toward me and toward yourself," cried Archie, "as to persist in this refusal. Yes, toward yourself, Blanche, for the love of a heart like yours does not die out like a common passion. It resists time and all its vicissitudes. Jules will plead my cause on his return, and his sister will not refuse him his first request. Oh, tell me that I may hope." "Never, Archie, never," said Blanche. "The women of my family, as well as the men, have never failed in their duty, have never shrunk from any sacrifice, however painful. 2 of my aunts, while yet very young, said one day to my father, 'You have no more than enough, d'Haberville, to maintain the dignity of the house. Our dowry would make a considerable breach in your means. To-morrow we shall enter a convent, where all is prepared to receive us.' Prayers, threats, the fury of my father, all proved vain. They entered the convent, where they have not wearied of good deeds to this day. As for me, Archie, I have other duties to perform, duties very dear to me. I must sweeten life as far as possible for my parents, must help them to forget their misfortunes, must care for them in their old age, and must close their eyes at the last. My brother Jules will marry, I will nurse his children and share alike his good and evil fortune." Lochiel and Blanche walked toward the house in silence. The last rays of the setting sun, mirrored in the swelling tide, lent a new charm to the enchanting scene, but to their eyes the loveliness of nature seemed to have suddenly faded out. The next day, toward evening, a favorable wind arose. The vessel which had brought Lochiel weighed anchor at once, and M. d'Haberville instructed José to convey his young friend to Quebec. During the journey there was no lack of conversation between the 2 travelers. Their subjects were inexhaustible. Toward 5 o'clock in the morning, however, as they were passing Beaumont, Lochiel said to José, "I am as sleepy as a marmot. We sat up late yesterday, and I was so feverish that I got no sleep for the rest of the night. Do sing me a song to keep me awake." He knew the hoarseness and vigor of his companion's voice, and he put great faith in it as an anti-soporific. "I cannot refuse," answered José, who, like many others blessed with a discordant voice, prided himself greatly on his singing. "The more sleepy you are, the more risk you run of breaking your head on the rocks, which have never been cleared away since La Corriveau's memorable trip. But I hardly know what to begin with. How would you like a song on the taking of Berg op Zoom?" "Berg op Zoom will do," said Archie, "though the English were pretty badly treated there." "Hem, hem," coughed José. "Nothing like a little revenge on the enemy that handled us so roughly in '59. And he struck up the following: "A Te Deum for him who was born the Doom, a Te Deum for him who was born the Doom, of the stout-walled city of Berg op Zoom, of the stout-walled city of Berg op Zoom. By Our Lady he wants the best that's going, who can do up a siege in a style so knowing." "How charmingly naive!" cried Lochiel. "Is it not, Captain?" said José, very proud of his success. "Indeed, yes, my dear José. But go on. I am in a hurry to hear the end. Do not halt upon so good a road." "Thank you, Captain," said José, touching his cap. "Like Alexander who lived of old, like Alexander who lived of old, his body is small, but his heart is bold. His body is small, but his heart is bold. God gave him all Alexander's wit and Caesar's wisdom on top of it." "His body is small, but his heart is bold," repeated Archie, "is a very happy touch. Where did you pick up this song?" A grenadier who was at the siege of Bergopzoom sang it to my late father. He said that it was terribly hot work there, and he carried the marks of it. He had only one eye left, and the skin was torn off his face from his forehead to his jawbone. But as all these damages were on the left side, he still could manage his gun properly on the right. But let us leave him to look out for himself. He is a jolly lad who would dance a jig on his own grave, and I need not concern myself about him. Here's the third and last verse. Oh, we combed the hides of the English well. Oh, we combed the hides of the English well. A very bad lot, as I've heard tell. A very bad lot, as I've heard tell. They'll shake by Our Lady till they get home, for fear of our boys and their curry comb. Delightful 'pon honour, cried Lochiel. These English who wear a very bad lot, these soldiers armed with the curry comb, how exquisitely naive, charming. By Our Lady, though, Captain, said José, they are not always so easy to comb, these English. Like our good horse Lubin here, they are sometimes very bad-humored and ugly to handle if one rubs them too hard. Witness the first battle of the Plains of Abraham. It was the English, was it not, who carried the curry-comb then? Remarked Archie. For reply, José merely lifted up the stump of his arm, around which he had twisted the leather of his whip. For a time our travelers journeyed on in silence, and again Archie grew heavy with sleep. Perceiving this, José cried, Captain, Captain, you're nearly asleep. Take care, or you're going to break your nose, begging your pardon. I think you want another song to wake you up. Shall I sing you the complaint of Biron? Who was Biron? Inquired Lochiel. Uncle Raoul, who is so learned, told me that he was a prince, a great warrior, the relative and friend of our late King Henry IV, which did not prevent the latter from having him executed, just as if he was a nobody. When I made my lament upon his death, Uncle Raoul and the captain told me that he had proved a traitor to the king, and forbid me even to sing the complaint in their presence. This struck me as rather droll, but I obeyed them all the same. I have never heard of this lament, said Archie, and as I am not particularly sensitive in regard to the kings of France, I wish you would sing it for me. Thereupon José struck up, in a voice of thunder, the following lament. The king he had been warned by one of his gendarmes, his name it was Lafin, that gave him the alarm. Your Majesty, I pray you, of Prince Biron beware, for he's plotting wicked deeds, and there's treason in the air. Lafin had hardly spoke when Prince Biron came in. His cap was in his hand, and he bowed before the king. Said he, Wilt please your Majesty to try your hand at play? Here's 1,000 Spanish doubloons that I have won this day. If you have them with you, Prince, replied his Majesty. If you have them with you, Prince, go find the Queen, and she will play you for the Spanish gold you have not long to see. He had not played 2 games when the constable came in, and bowing, cap in hand, right courtly said to him, Oh, will you rise up, Prince, and come along with me? This night in the Bastille your bed and board shall be. Oh, had I but my sword, my weapon bright and keen, Oh, had I but my sabre, my knife of golden sheen, no constable should capture me that ever I have seen. It might have been a month, or maybe 2 weeks more, that no friends came to see him or passed his prison door. At last came judges 3, pretending not to know, and asked of him, Fair prince, oh, who has used you so? Oh, they who used me so had power to put me here. It was the king and queen whom I served for many a year. And now for my reward, my death it draweth near. And does the king remember no more the Savoy War? And has the king forgotten the wounds for him I bore? And is it my true service now that I must suffer for? And has the king forgotten that if I have to die, the blood of Biron may to heaven for vengeance cry? Or does the king remember I have a brother yet? But when he sees the king, he will not me forget. By this time Lochiel was thoroughly awake. The tremendous voice of José would have awakened the sleeping beauty herself from the depths of her 100 years' slumber. But you, sir," said José, "you who are nearly as learned as Uncle Raoul, you could perhaps tell me something of this wicked king, who so ungratefully put this poor Monsieur Biron to death." "Kings, my dear José, never forget a personal offense, and like a great many smaller people who cannot overlook the faults of others, no matter how well atoned for faithful services their memory is very short." "Well now, but that seems very queer to me, when I was thinking that the good God had given them everything that heart could wish. A short memory, but that is droll." Smiling at his companion's innocence, Archie replied, "King Henry IV, however, had an excellent memory, although it failed him in that one instance. He was a good prince, and loved his subjects as if they were his own children, and he did all he could to make them happy. It is not surprising that his memory is cherished by all good Frenchmen, even after a lapse of 150 years." "By Our Lady," exclaimed José, "there's nothing surprising in that if the subjects have a better memory than their princes. It was cruel of him, however, to hang this poor Monsieur Biron." "The nobility of France were never hung," said Archie. "That was one of their special privileges. They simply had their heads cut off." "That was indeed a privilege. It may perhaps hurt more, but it is much more glorious to die by the sword than by the rope," remarked José. "To return to Henry IV," said Archie, "we must not be too severe in our condemnation of him. He lived in a difficult period, a period of civil war. Biron, his kinsman and former friend, turned traitor, and was doubly deserving of his fate." "Poor Monsieur Biron," said José, "but he speaks finely in his lament." "It is not always they who speak the best who have the most right on their side," remarked Archie. "There is no one so like an honest man as an eloquent knave." "All very true, Mr. Archie. We have one poor thief in our district, and as he doesn't know how to defend himself, everybody is continually getting his teeth into him, while his brother, who is 100 times worse than he, has so smooth a tongue that he passes himself off for a little saint. Meanwhile, yonder is Quebec, but no more the white flag waving over her," added José, sighing. To hide his emotion, he went searching in all his pockets for his pipe, grumbling to himself and repeating his old refrain, "Our good folk will come again." José spent 2 days in Quebec and returned loaded with all the presents that Archie thought would find acceptance at d'Haberville Manor. Such rich gifts as he would have sent under other circumstances he dared not send now, for fear of wounding his friends. In bidding José farewell, he said, "I left my prayer book at the manor house. Beg Miss Blanche to take care of it till I return. It was a keepsake." End of chapter 16.